I certainly started my career in engineering at almost an accidental time, because I started at the very start of the internet, when certainly folk in the communications bodies here thought this strange stuff called packet switching would never catch on. And of course, over the last 40 years, it has completely revolutionized the world. So it's been an interesting time to be around. But I moved on, in a sense, from that. I was asked to run a government agency. So I had very much a crash course in how to work with ministers. And the advice I would give on that, and it applies to science diplomacy too, is it's all about language. So in many cases, scientists or engineers don't really share a common language with a minister or a policymaker. They're coming from different places. And so it's important for the scientist or the engineer to translate their discipline into something the policymaker will understand. So, for example, when I took over a government agency which managed all the use of radio communication in the UK, broadcasting, telecoms, navigation, it had serious problems because its legislation dated from 1948, based on 1919, and things have kind of moved on since then. And so we had major problems with that legislation. My predecessors have been able to convince ministers that we needed new primary legislation, which is a difficult thing. What I was able to do was to say, well, we have to talk to ministers in a language they understand. And my Secretary of State will understand jobs and GDP. So hire some economists, which we did. Tell me, oh economist, if we take this stuff which we'll call spectrum, in a sense a bit like crude oil, as you refine spectrum into telecoms, broadcasting and navigation, just as you refine crude oil into petrochemicals, what's the gross value added and how many people are employed? And that work was done in 1995, and it turned out that those spectrum using industries, broadcasting, navigation and so on, were growing at 7.5% per annum in real terms, and were generating 1,000 jobs a week. So I could go to my Secretary of State and say, great news, Secretary of State, for your next speech. This area you're presiding over is growing at 1,000 jobs a week and 7.5% per annum real. But by the way, it's going straight into a brick wall, and it's your fault. And I got my legislation, despite the fact my department was saying you've got no chance. We've got other priorities. But it was all about language. And that, I think, is the key here. As scientists or engineers, we tend to presume people understand what we're talking about. And it's often a false presumption. And that's particularly true when you're well outside the UK. And so we need to establish common ground. And in many areas, for example, now in the UK, we use things we call technology translators, because you can't. One example, there is if you're running a small, medium-sized business, and you have a problem which has a mathematical basis, you've probably got no way of communicating that with a university maths professor. So we'd bring in a translator who would take that problem, reframe it in a sense that an academic can understand, and then they can get on with it. And that's been hugely successful. So all of this is about context, it's about language, it's also about honesty.
And
yeah.
So the concept of science diplomacy, based on your experience, how do you understand that? And has that understanding changed over time?
I think it's important to recognize that there are areas that can be usefully addressed by science. It's really important that that science is honest and rigorous, because there is always a suspicion that somehow the scientist or the engineer is spinning that science in favor of the position they would like to have. And that is really, really damaging. So, for example, I was one of those who investigated the climatic research unit at the University of East Anglia, when before the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference, they had a leak of emails which was very damaging. And it was interesting that we duplicated some of their research, in fact, and we found that they had not necessarily communicated well, but they had certainly been honest. But some people on the internet tried to threaten me with professional misconduct, because if I'd been competent, I had clearly found that they were dishonest. So there are real challenges out there, and it's really important to have research integrity, structures and things to show that the advice that you're giving is unbiased. You can then make a policy decision based on it or not, that's your view. But I'm not going to try and spin that information in favour of one policy decision or another.
So In the many positions you have held throughout your career, is there any field where you feel that science diplomacy has often been used as a tool?
Oh, you see, I haven't really done that much science diplomacy. The nearest I would have come is that when I ran the Radio Communications Agency as chief executive, I had ambassadorial powers to sign into law international treaties, because the way in which the radio spectrum is carved up globally is done through the International Telecoms Union and through treaty-making conferences. And what that taught us was the need to have friends and preparation. So, for example, my agency, in fact, before my time, had set up the European Radio Office, which was broader than the European Community, the EU. And we would spend a lot of time getting together a common European position with, I think in those days, 43 or 44 countries, with one country, one vote. We could take a vote of 44 into the International Telecoms Union. And so the importance of building relationships, working with friends, coming to a common position, which may not be the position you entirely wanted, but at least it's shared and common. And then using the power of that in diplomacy is important.
And continuing a little bit on the international track here, how do you think that innovation can be used to foster diplomatic relations between the UK and Latin America? This is the focus of this conference.
I think what we should be doing with our friends in Latin America is helping them to say, what you shouldn't be doing is just copying what we've been doing in Europe. You can see, we can see together where this is going to go. Why don't we help you get to that position? We used to call it, when I worked in policy and government, an intercept strategy, not a follower strategy. And I think it's really important that we help our Latin American friends understand where this is going, and if they choose to, how they might intercept that and how we might support them in doing so, rather than encouraging them just to follow.
Do you think we can learn from them?
I think we can certainly learn from them. There are tremendous resources there. There are also particular skills. You know, I've learnt today, coming here, debating with these young leaders from across Latin America. That's valuable to me. So dialogue is always valuable.
And in terms of fostering this international scientific collaboration, what role do you think that a summit like Shaping Horizons can play?
It builds networks, and that, I think, is key. And I think we can also share some of the things that we have done in the UK. So I was for 18 years a member of the board of our Parliament's Office of Science and Technology, which, to be clear, is not part of the civil service. It's part of the Parliament. And that idea, which curiously enough started under Margaret Thatcher, has been exported to many other European countries. And now there is a pan-European body called STOA, the Society of Technology Offices of Assessment or something like that. It is also being exported into Africa and so on. And so structures which enable absolutely honest, evidence-based scientific analysis to be shared with policymakers. So they can then decide what they do with it, whether they believe it, whether they don't believe it, but it is entirely straightforward, factually based and unspun. And I think that's been a great development to the UK, and I think we have exported it quite successfully.
And for you personally, why did you decide to take part in Shaping Horizons?
Because I was asked. But I like the interaction with young people. And I have to recognise, despite the fact I've spent 40 years, more than 40 years now, in an area which has been enormously dynamic, the internet and electronic commerce and so on, I don't have the insights that another generation, perhaps 2 generations younger than me, have. And I need to understand those. One of the things I was encouraging the delegates here to say was, see if you can do some reverse mentoring, get people to accept you as their mentors, people of my generation in policy positions, to have you as their mentor in certain aspects that they have no instinctive grasp of because they didn't grow up with it, and you do.
Have you had the opportunity to communicate a bit with the future leaders?
Yes, it's been enormous fun in talking with their syndicates and the plenary and so on. And it's a delight to see the energy that's there and the desire to make beneficial change.